Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 13th episode of Chebacco Chats. Our guest today is Sean Cox. Sean is well known to lots of people in our audience, I'm sure. Sean grew up in Mount Desert Island. He went to MDI High. He was a park ranger through high school, where he led tours of George Dorr's estate, Oldfarm. He went on to go to the University of Maine for his bachelor's degree and master's degree in history, which he will earn this summer. And from here, he's headed to the University of New Brunswick to work on his Ph.D. in history. So he's got a good following here, lots of people cheering him on. And though he may be a young historian, this is an old topic for Sean. And he wrote an article for the 2018 issue of Chebacco called Foundation and Founder. It's the story of George Dorr and his estate at Old Town. So Sean, welcome to Chebacco Chats.
Thank you, Tim. You want to say yay, lucky number 13. I hope all the technical stuff holds out for us. I do want to very quickly first say thank you to you and the Historical Society for continuing to make the best of a bad situation and present digitally these stories that we'd much rather tell live. So thank you for keeping these conversations going.
Well, we're happy to do it. And let's see, just let me check. You're looking at the cover slide now,
Yep.
Are you? Okay, good.
Yep.
So sometimes what we see at this end isn't what our audience sees. So I want to make sure you're doing that. So Sean, let's begin at the beginning. Tell us how you first encountered this story of Oldfarm and George Dorr.
Sure. Well, I personally encountered this environment and this landscape and perhaps the name fairly early on. So I learned to say that, I'm not a Mainer. I was born in Michigan and we moved here when I was very little. I actually had my first birthday in Maine. So, I'd like to say I'm a local, but I know I'm not a Mainer. But while growing up on MDI, we were taken to Oldfarm and to the shore by some friends. And that's where I kind of started experiencing that landscape. And I was always—
How old were you then?
Oh, I must have been 3 or 4 at this point. We just moved to Maine.
Yeah.
So we were kind of familiarizing ourselves with the area, and that's, I guess, when I started to hear and growing up through grade school in Connors Emerson on the island, that that area was Mr. Dorr's, or that the area right by the edge of the shoreline, that was Mr. Dorr's swimming pool.
Yeah.
So that was, I guess, my first engagement with the landscape. And then academically, or at least professionally, I should say first, working in the National Park Service, I was able to, through the generous professional development of folks like Kathy Grant and Betty Lyle, to go on some of these ranger programs, and then eventually to start leading them as well too. So I got to tell these stories to the public.
Great. Well, let me figure out how to share this screen properly.
Sure.
Because I want your audience to see this. And I think you're looking at what I want you to look at, right?
I've got your email up.
Oh, that's not right. Okay. Let me try it again. How about now?
There we go.
Very good. Well, Sean, how about, why don't you read us a section of your article?
Sure. Let's see. So, while wandering through its ruins, one is still impressed by elements of George Dorr's once grand estate. Though left to the main elements for over 60 years, intricate herringbone brickwork patios have defied the frost heaves. Still, time has taken its toll. The lawns that held grandiose social tea parties for the summering elite have been obscured by new forest growth. The walls around the porch where Dorr entertained intimate friends and congressional representatives are slowly disintegrating. Trees sprout where Dorr's famous library once stood, and the servants' entrance and kitchen have slowly faded into the forest floor. Though the loss of this historic landmark is tragic, its ruins and the surrounding national park are perhaps more valuable to the community than the mansion itself ever was. The members of local families and adventurous visitors who explore this corner of Acadia still benefit from the peace, the quiet, and the beauty that Oldfarm grounds still protect and preserve.
And let's get our whole audience oriented to where we are. Can you tell, so this is a place that anyone can visit. Can you give us directions?
Sure. So basically how I gave directions for visitors to find me at my program is you drive south of Bar Harbor on Route 3, and as soon as you get out of town proper, you pass by the athletic field, the baseball field that you see marked in green on the map. You'll end up looking for a small gravel parking lot. There's not a lot of infrastructure. It's very difficult to see unless you're actually purposefully looking for it. There are a few signs once you get into the parking lot by the edge of the trailhead, but there's very little in the way to actually notate this place as being a significant landscape. So just before you get to Jackson Lab on Route 3, south of Bar Harbor.
And this is an evocative place. You know the history is there, and sometimes it emerges from the ground. Tell us, we didn't exactly plan this question this way, but tell us how it makes you feel. What kind of sense do you get when you go to this place today?
Well, I enjoy the landscape for a number of reasons, because I still have the childhood connection growing up and going to these places. I remember just while we were getting set up for this that a couple of friends and I ended up filming some, 7th or 8th grade school project out there in the middle of the woods on the foundation. But it's a landscape that locals engage with frequently, even if we're not entirely sure or not remembering the whole story. But I had such a great time taking visitors on this tour. And, there would be days where it was bright and sunny and I'd have 35 or 40 people on a tour. And then there were other days that it was pouring down rain and I would still have one family show up and we'd do the tour in the pouring rain. And we'd explore the ruins and I'd tell them all the stories. And it was just one of the best professional and academic experiences I've had in an outdoor classroom.
Well, I want to invite our viewers as we go along to ask us questions. If you're watching on Zoom, you can do that by the Q&A function or by chat. We'll see either one of those. If you're on Facebook, just make a comment and we'll see that before we're done. We'll try to answer that question. So, Sean, when was Oldfarm built? Who built it?
Sure. So, George B. Dorr is who we're talking about, but really he doesn't enter into the story quite yet. His parents, Charles and Mary Dorr, they were fairly wealthy Bostonites. They inherited a significant amount of wealth from rich families. And during that period of the late 19th century, the fashion then, especially after the Civil War, was to locate a place for wealthy individuals to purchase a small piece of land to get away to. It was a healthy retreat. The medical wisdom of the day said that seaside breezes were best for health. You'd avoid the sweltering cities, you'd avoid some of the major catastrophes of living in close quarters. So the Dorrs, Charles and Mary, made a trip in 1868 up to Mount Desert Island, and they fell in love with the place, as many visitors and probably a significant number of our audience can attest to. It's a familiar feeling. So they decided to come up and visit frequently, but they purchased the Oldfarm land in 1868 and began planning and constructing the building over the next couple of years. Their main architect was actually a Boston and Maine architect, Henry Richards. And in 1878 and 1879, the majority of the construction was finally completed under the direction of Charles and Mary.
All right. So how is the building positioned in the landscape? What would you or I'm sorry, why don't you describe the building for us? The image we're looking at looks really complicated architecturally. So describe the building to us.
It's supposed to be complicated. This is as much a status symbol as anything else would have been during that time. So the landscape obviously would have been meticulously cleared of trees and extensive lawns put in. And we can tell this from a number of different things in the landscape, and we'll get there. But the building itself, you can see the ground floor, especially that first floor that we're looking at with the patchwork walls, those were mostly constructed of granite. And anyone who knows Mount Desert Island knows that there's a significant amount of granite everywhere. And especially on the Bar Harbor side, the pink formation, that Cadillac granite pink, that was what was used in that first layer. Beyond that, brickwork was matched. So there was the nice red of the brickwork with the local pink granite. But then that's where things started to get a little bit more complicated and expensive, because in the interior, some of the main support structures, they were built of white pine. And white pine is fairly prevalent here in Maine, but according to George's own account, it was Michigan white pine that they actually used. So there is some debate as to whether available timber in Maine, comparable timber, was available at all, or whether it had mostly been exhausted by that point for other projects or other industries.
Mm-hmm.
And then as soon as you get to the roof, that's where it gets a little bit more extreme, because it was clad in redwood shingles. So redwood shingles from California, it's a 3,000-mile journey across the continent, and that would have been made possible by the Transcontinental Railroad. So this is a status symbol, not only in that it's complicated and opulent, but by the very building materials that were used.
And the building took full advantage of its place in the landscape as well. So talk to us about how it fit into the environment.
And this is a wonderful picture, actually, because this is the porch where Dorr used to entertain guests. And the view that you're seeing right now is not the view you get today from that same exact porch. The Missing Mansion Ranger-led tour, we would bring people right onto that porch and tell them, well, you know, 60, 70 years ago, the trees were all clear-cut and we had these big sweeping lawns, and you could see out to Frenchman Bay and the Porcupine Islands that you're seeing right now. So how it fit in the landscape, it was meant to emphasize the elevation. It is kind of on a cliff edge, and you can actually see a decent way out into the bay and to the mainland Schoodic Peninsula beyond. Big windows and these grand walkways, the porch and the piazza, these were all designed to take advantage of the coastal scenery.
So we could still go to this very spot depicted here today, right? But what we would see is a wall of trees. Exactly,
yeah. There's significant new growth that has sprung up in the 60, 70 years since. This is certainly not the view that you'd get. You'd have to get much closer to the shoreline to even get a glimpse as to, oh yeah, that's right, we're by the ocean.
So there's more to this place than the architecture and the environment, but there's a history of what happened here. So tell us about how George Dorr used this location and this old farm structure to advance the interests of Acadia National Park.
So in the development of this cottage, as they called it, this was the grand cottage age of Mount Desert Island and specifically Bar Harbor. So this was essentially a membership card, owning an estate like this into the inner circles of the summering elite. Not that the Dorrs were any stranger to inner circles of upper echelons of society. They had been running in those circles for generations. But in this new landscape that was being created in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, this was a transplanted elite. So this landscape gave them access to a natural environment that wasn't a built-up city like Boston. It did allow them to explore walking paths, shorelines, and come in contact with environments that, you know, we in Maine are fairly familiar with. But if you grew up in an inner city in the late 19th century, you wouldn't have the opportunity to just go get lost in a forest or wander a shoreline. So this gave George an opportunity to engage with this environment and fall in love with it. As his father died in 1893 and his mother died in 1901, George was gradually left by himself with this grand estate. He was never really meant to inherit all of this. He had an older brother who also died. So this was a tragic series of events that left George not only by himself, but the inheritor of a significant fortune and this grand estate in Bar Harbor. So once he had come into all of this wealth, and for all accounts, he had exhausted most of his general interests. He was working with Harvard, he was a lecturer, he toured around both Europe and the continental United States. But by about 1901, he seemed like he was ready for the next great adventure. And this gentleman scholar, very well-educated man, fell into this summer circle that he was familiar with for seasons now. And Charles Eliot called a meeting in 1901 and eventually formed the Hancock County Trustees of Public Reservations, which ultimately would help create Sieur de Monts National Monument. But in that first meeting, only a few months after his mother had passed away, George was named vice president and in charge of land acquisitions. This was the next big step in his life, and then devoted the next decades of his life and a significant amount of his wealth to protecting this environment that he had become so familiar with.
And I guess the location of Oldfarm, very near the downtown Bar Harbor, made it kind of a hub where you can see from an image like this that it was fully engaged with the coast and the forest, but also conveniently located to people he might want to run into or get to in a hurry or conveniently.
Exactly. And he was very well connected with this community. And in terms of the legacy that he leaves on the island and in this landscape, it's more than just Acadia. He was involved with the Jessup Library. He was involved with the YMCA. He helped create the athletic field in Bar Harbor. He helped in the donation of land for Jackson Lab. He helped in the design and creation of the Building of the Arts, which unfortunately is no longer with us because of the 1947 fire. So he left his mark not only in the natural landscape and in the national park, but in the lived community that we're familiar with today too.
Wow. What a operator, somebody who could pull so many people together for many common purposes.
Exactly.
Well, so George Dorr dies in 1944, and what happened to the Oldfarm estate after that?
So this is the great tragedy that we're talking about. So in the mid-40s and early 50s, the priorities of the National Park Service were very different than what they are today. And in the Mission 66 ideology of the National Park Service, it was dedicated to visitor services, creating visitor centers, but also preserving more natural landscapes and perhaps less focused on preserving or renovating some of these historic structures. So in about 4 days after George's passing, Benjamin Hadley had a quick evaluation of all of the contents of Oldfarm and found that there were a whole bunch of items that could be used. That's wonderful, and repurposed just as George intended. He wanted things to remain useful. Where this diverged from his overall vision of the property and the house is that the house was already decades old by this point, and it is a significant investment to keep something like this running. So by, I think it was, yes, 1948, the Park Service hired 2 architects, an architect and an engineer that were very unfamiliar with this landscape, to come up and give an evaluation of the property. And I've read through their extensive report, and they proposed several different options. One of them was to turn it into a museum. One of them was to turn it into park housing. Another one was to convert it into park headquarters of some kind. But realistically, and unfortunately most cost effectively, they suggested stripping it of all of the valuable materials, building materials, construction materials, anything that you could pull out of this opulently built estate, and then tear it to the ground because it just cost less. And unfortunately, that's what was agreed to in this Mission 66 vision. Trying to keep up a decades-old mansion, it just wasn't in the cards. It wasn't in the funding.
Well, it's a shame to lose it. What do you think of that decision? Can you put yourself? How would you judge that decision? Is it fair to put yourself in that seat 70 years ago, and would you have kept it, or do you think it was the right decision to make, or do you think it was the wrong decision?
Well, it's very difficult to make that type of decision from this point today, since we're so in love with this environment and this landscape, and inspired by George's story and the family. So it's difficult to say that, you know, it was a good call, because many of us would say no, preserve the building. But having worked in the National Park Service and seen what budgets look like and where things need to be cut and how tight it is to run such a massive operation that's beloved by millions, without proper and adequate funding, difficult decisions are made in the Park Service. And what I really hope that, you know, if we can take anything away from this tragedy, it's that we need to look more deeply and more closely at what we are preserving and what we intend for future generations to see. This is a historic landscape, and we recognize that today. And the difficult decision to destroy the house was boiled down to numbers, and a Park Service shouldn't have to do that. So I'm hoping that other folks have the same opinion, that funding the National Park Service and making sure that some of these environments that don't seem to be important right now might still yet be preserved, because they might be important in the future too.
And I guess we can get the most out of the site now. One of the things we feature in this presentation are the contemplative photographs of Jennifer Steen Brewer, who really takes an up-close look at some of the remnants. We also have photographs that we've presented from the archives of the National Park Service, and that might be the best what we can do. But Sean, tell us what it's like to walk through the site now.
So walking from the tiny little gravel parking lot that you start at, you have a nice long kind of sweeping pathway through overgrown woods. Reading the landscape, you can see how this environment was used and how it used to be very well maintained. So in the article and on the program that I gave, you know, as you're walking along, look at some of the trees, look at some of the landscapes, and see what doesn't make sense. This wasn't always just a forest. So some of the things like the giant white pines typically, naturally, in a crowded forest environment, grow tall and straight and lose their limbs very quickly. But the white pines on the Dorr estate are branching. They're huge, they're distorted, they're twisting all over the place. So you can see that for decades, these trees were exposed to a wide open environment, and now they're just crowded amongst the forest. So you have some natural indicators to read the environment and read the landscape and notice some of these things. So I enjoy walking through and trying to read these pieces, whether they're made out of brick or they're a tree. You can also see some of the invasive species that are still around in this environment. One of the many ventures that George and actually his mother Mary were interested in were botanicals, and in growing anything and everything for this island and for the estates that were built after. So the Mount Desert nurseries were established, and while many things were indigenous to this environment, there were also a lot of things that Mary brought up, and a few that George brought up, I believe, as well, that are invasive. So you can read that landscape too. You can tell that this has been at least altered or gardened in a way that was conducive to an elite, visually pleasing landscape. And then when you actually arrive on the foundation itself, it's wonderful to be able to walk through the floor plan, to walk around on this right here, this section that we see. That's the same little plaza, the little deck that's outside of the piazza. That's where you'd be looking out onto Frenchman Bay. Of course, you can't see it now, but you can still hear the ships going by. You can still hear the cruise ships in a normal season. And it's wonderful to imagine him pacing back and forth through his extensive library, and coming up with ways to get himself involved.
And the present day Park Service is managing this space fairly aggressively, given the environment. There is an app for that. There are walking stations. There are places where you can pause and listen to a little minute-long lecture on your phone. So it's managed rather as best they can, given the environment that remains.
Exactly. And the Missing Mansion Tour is still on the books for ranger-led programs as well, too.
And there's an app for that. You can download it onto your phone. It has this really intriguing model of Oldfarm that you can rotate and examine up close, and stations all along the way that will let you have an interpreted tour of the place.
Exactly.
Well, Sean, tell us at last, what is the message and meaning of Oldfarm? Give us that larger picture of what it means. What do you think it means to us now?
To me, it's a complicated landscape. It means the elite wealth of some of the major urban cities were able to procure environments or plots of land like this for their own development. So at a time when Bar Harbor and Mount Desert Island was becoming increasingly carved up by private entities and corporations, some of them began to look around and realize that that's not what they wanted for the whole island or for the future of the island either. So it is an elite space, and the creation of the park was primarily out of elite money, and it preserved spaces for all in federal protection, but it was born out of elite wealth. So it is a complicated landscape and a complicated relationship between extreme wealth and openness and accessibility. And I think that Dorr, having inherited a lot of this wealth, was able to look around and put it to good use and make it more about what he envisioned for the future than what he personally wanted now. So I think that this tiny corner of the park is significant not just because there was a house there, but this was the mansion where an idea formed and created a park that we can still tour today.
Wow. Well, it really helps me understand this place better. I'm looking forward to my next visit. Let's invite our audience to tell us what kind of questions they have. We're welcome any comments or questions you might give to us. An old friend of ours, Sean, Maureen Fournier, asks or mentions FOA volunteers, Friends of Acadia volunteers, are recently working with the park, clearing the foundation. Are you happy to work to clean up the property of trees?
Absolutely. I think that if done appropriately, that the foundation should maintain some sort of prominence in the land. It likely should not and would not ever go back to a clear-cut landscape ever. But making sure that we can still see the foundation is an important message, at least for me, so that it's a lesson learned for us. We still get to tell the story of the Doors and how the park was formed, but we also have to tell the story of why isn't the mansion there. And I think that that's important, not just for understanding why we're standing in a national park, but what do we want that national park to look like, or their priorities to be beyond our lifetime?
Well, Sean, I want to get a little personal now. You're headed for University of New Brunswick. You're building on your master's degree. Is there any link between the work that you did here as a high school student in the park and what you've pursued in your studies at Orono and that you hope to pursue in New Brunswick?
Absolutely. So my current advisor, Dr. Mark McLaughlin, will vouch for the fact that tourism definitely plays a large role in what I've constructed for my MA. And what I hope to do for my PhD is to continue that work. So as of right now, I'm working on finishing a project about automobility in Maine and New Brunswick, creating this tourism landscape of vacation land around the turn of the century. So it is very much inspired by what Dorr was doing at the time, what the Hancock County trustees were doing, and the landscape that I grew up in and worked in as well too. So absolutely, I think that this is a fairly strong foundation.
Well, Sean, it's been great having you on Chebacco Chats. The time flies by, it's all gone now. I wish you the best for the rest of the summer in your future studies. I know you have some hurdles to overcome in getting your work completed at Orono and getting your new life started at University of New Brunswick, but I'm sure you'll be successful in that. And all of us wish you the best, and thanks very much for coming on to this show to share what you know about Oldfarm with us.
Thank you, Tim. Keep telling the stories. Thank you.
All right. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next week, next Thursday at 4:30. We're going to be talking with Rock Cavano about the Somesville Bridge, and it's going to be a really interesting story. It's one of the most photographed places in Maine. Really interesting man, really beloved character on this island. So I hope you can join us then. In the meantime, take care of each other, take care of yourselves. We'll see you next week.